Good morning, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the podcast, The Endurance of Labor Laws. I am your lovely host, Lesley Sullivan, and today is episode 93, and we are going to take a look at a very interesting labor union. It's one that is no longer around, but yet it still kind of is, so this is kind of like a two-for-one special. It is called the International Typographical Union. So let's go ahead and get started on this puppy. But first of all, let me give a big shout out to my listeners. So a big shout out to Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, my lovely neighbor, Oklahoma, California, Oregon, and New York. In terms of countries, the United States, the Russian Federation, and Canada. Okay, so this one is very interesting. So let's see. It was founded May 3rd, 1852. It was dissolved December 31st, 1986, and it dissolved for several reasons. So one of the reasons why it dissolved was because it did not keep up with the times in terms of inventions and innovations, and so their members left. A lot of them left, and they went and either formed their own labor unions or they joined other labor unions. So, even though we don't really use typography like what they're talking about, we still have printing presses, we still have magazines, newspapers, books, publications, things like that. But unfortunately, they did not keep up with what they should have been keeping up with. So that's very unfortunate with that. So it says here, the International Typographical Union was a United States trade union for the printing trade for newspapers and other media. It was founded on May 3rd, 1852 in the United States as the National Typographical Union and changed its name to the International Typographical Union at its convention in 1869. Now, I kind of don't like that part because here's the thing. They were never an international union. So I kind of feel like they changed their name just as kind of like name dropping. It'd be like, for example, if I say, oh, I know Ellen DeGeneres. And let's see, and I'm friends with everybody on the crew or the cast of that 70s show. I personally know Ashton Kutcher and his wife, Mia. None of that is true. I don't know any of those people. I'm sure they're good, kind people, but I don't know any of them. But it's one of those things, if you name drop, it's kind of like making yourself seem like you're more important than you really are. And to me, that's cocky and arrogance. And whenever someone is cocky and has arrogance, that tells me they lack confidence. So I think from the get-go, this union had some issues, especially with the people that founded it. So I'm kind of not surprised that they disbanded, considering that they're changing their title from being a national union to an international union. And mind you, there's nothing wrong with being a national union. That's wonderful. It's always good to have that, good beginnings and everything. But we know they're not an international union because they never merged with any other unions outside the United States. Nor were there ever any officers that were elected to their union or under the umbrella of their union. There were never officers from other countries elected to positions of power within their union, so they were not an international union. So that's why I feel like, okay, they're just name dropping, so that's a problem there. I'm not a big fan of that. So then it says the ITU was one of the first unions to admit female members. Now that part I really like, and here's why. What we need to remember is that during this time, women did not have the same kind of citizenship that men did. And the reason why, one of the reasons why is because women could not vote. They also could not hardly own any property or own a company. It was very difficult to do that for them. And here's the reason why. So I'm just going to give some examples and you can kind of draw your own conclusions. But just FYI, if you hear sizzling, I'm actually cooking some sausage at the moment. And I'm also trying to clean a counter because it's sticky and I don't know what that's from. It's probably from a lemon from the other day. But anyway, so in regards to what women had to deal with, and it's very unfortunate. So again, women could not vote at that time. It was very difficult for them to own or inherit property. So let's kind of go at the basics here. So women back then, when they married, they had to have a dowry. Now, for those that don't know what a dowry is, and I wouldn't be surprised if people did not know this because there's a lot of stuff that's not being taught in schools anymore. A lot of history, a lot of stuff is being suppressed from our children and from future generations of Americans, and I think that is extremely wrong and unethical, but unfortunately, it means that we have to go over stuff that we normally would not because people don't know, and they don't know because they're not being taught, and they probably don't even know where to look with stuff like this. But here's the thing. Let's say, for example, you want to marry me. Let's say you're a man and you're like, hey, Lesley, I want to marry you. I'm going to propose to you, blah, blah, blah. Of course, it probably wouldn't go down like that. It'd probably be way more special than how I just worded it. But for the sake of this podcast, we're going to keep it simple because there's nothing wrong with being romantic and being kind. But here's the thing. So say, for example, you want to marry me. Well, in order for you to marry me, my family would have to give you and your family, the groom and the groom's family, a huge fee. And that fee is what is called a dowry. A dowry is what one family pays another family to pay for the upkeep of the wife that a man marries, because women were kind of viewed as a burden back then. And so they weren't treated as, oh, it's an honor to marry you. Not like it is today. It was a little bit different back then. Things were more contractual back then. So women were still kind of viewed as property. And so that's one reason why women were put in the position that they were in, was because they were viewed as property. And when you view someone as property, you don't really give them the benefit of the doubt, and you don't really treat them as an equal. Hence, they were not paid the same anyway. So let's say, my family pays you a bunch of money to marry me, and let's say we're actually in love. I don't like to think about marriages where people are not in love, but let's say we're actually in love with each other, and we're just going through the motions of what, stupid society says we have to do. So let's say my family pays you all this money, the dowry or whatever. Well, let's say, unfortunately, you pass away, and we've had a couple of kids. So now I'm a widow, and I've got 2 children. Let's make it 3. So I've got 3 children, and I'm a widow. And so, but when you passed away, you left me everything. You left me the house, you left me all your money, you left me your property, you left me all your assets, and you left me your company. Here's the thing. The moment I remarry, during this time in the 1860s, all that goes to my new husband. It does not stay with me, nor does it stay with my children. So that is one reason why there were so many women back then that stayed widows. They did not remarry because they did not want to lose their position of power. And plus, they didn't want their new husband, even if he's a great guy, they didn't want him to get everything just because he married her. You know what I mean? And it's just like, the guy wouldn't like that. I mean, would the guy like it if he, every time he got married, he had to give everything to his wife and not own anything? Nothing can be in his name, and he loses his company. I mean, like, put the shoe on the other foot here, kind of thing. So, yes, there were a lot of widows back in the day, but also a lot of them, they did not want to remarry because they didn't want to sacrifice all of that just for the sake of a society that didn't really have the best viewpoint of women. So that's not to say that there were not any good marriages or that there weren't pleasant people. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if that's how they viewed women in terms of marrying them, then why would we be surprised that they don't even want to pay women what they should be paid for a job? So it's kind of one of those things. Whenever you have a screwed up way of looking at someone in one area, it tends to flow over into other areas, and it's very sad, very unfortunate, but that's just part of our history. And hold on just a second while I get a drink of water. Okay, so the other thing to that is that during this time, there was a lower life expectancy across the board. Infancy deaths and childhood deaths were very common back then, because remember, antibiotics were not invented until like the 1940s, and vaccines were not invented. Well, the smallpox one was, but not like injections. It's like if you got exposed to like a cowpox sore or something like that. But I mean like vaccines like we have today. It wasn't like that back then. So you had a lot of widows and things like that. So the good thing about labor unions is that they were one of the first ones to say, hey, we need to have better benefits for our members, which were predominantly men who were the breadwinners for their families, because it was very common for men to get hurt on the job. And that doesn't mean that all employers were bad or that they didn't care about the working conditions. In fact, most employers were actually quite good. It's just that you have to think about these times in terms of the Industrial Revolution and post-Industrial Revolution. So as I've said in times past in this podcast, everything that we have today was pretty much built on something else in terms of technology and innovation. And whenever you are inventing something brand new that has never been done before, more than likely it's going to be a little dangerous and you have to work out the kinks. That's basically what this time frame is, okay? So it wasn't uncommon for people to get dismembered or to be killed on the job back then. That was common. It's not a pleasant thing, but that's just how it was back then. So unfortunately, there were a lot of widows and a lot of orphans because, the breadwinner was getting killed on the job and or dismembered. And so, one of the good things the labor union did is they went to bat for people, and not just this labor union, but pretty much all of them across the board. They went to bat for their members and said, hey, well, if you get hurt on the job, we want to make sure that your family's taken care of and that everything is on the up and up. So that way, your children are not orphaned and that, your family has access to food, water, and shelter. So it's one of the good things about this labor union. So it just makes me think in regards to women being admitted to this union, this labor union, I just wonder what some of the members thought about allowing women in there. Because if you can only imagine, if the mindset of women was, well, you can't even vote. Your place is at the home. Why aren't you just having kids? If that was the general rule or the general way of thinking about women, which it was, I'm surprised that a labor union would allow female members into their labor union. But kudos to them for doing that. I think that's a great leap of faith. And one thing I think about whenever I was reading about this union, it just made me think, I just wonder how much further down the road, I just wonder how further along we would be in terms of a country, in prosperity and progress, if women had always had the right to vote, and if women were always getting paid what they're supposed to be getting paid. I just wonder how much further down the road we would already be, and we wouldn't be having some of the issues that we're having to this day. So that's just one of the things that makes me think about, but there's always room for improvement, and, I'm not here to shame or blame. I just really thought about, what all my ancestors went through during that time, because my ancestors, I have ancestors from Europe, actually from several countries, but I'll just keep it short and sweet with that and say from Europe. But some of my ancestors immigrated over here and ended up in the northern part of the United States and the southern part of the United States. So I do know that they had to experience discrimination one way or another, and they also probably had a hard life at one point in time. And, when I look back at the genealogy, of my family, my mouth is really dry right now. When I look back at the genealogy of my family, I can see when we had infants die, childbirth and things like that. So, things were just different back then. So, I just wonder, it's kind of like, what if they had vaccines back in the 1800s, like what we have today? Just imagine, how many children would not have died in infancy, or died from measles, mumps, rubella, or what's it called, yellow fever or typhoid fever or things like that. Like there's all these childhood diseases that killed quite a few children way back in the day, but we take it for granted. And the fact that, hey, we made it to at least age 18. It was kind of those things that back during those days in the 1800s, if you made it to age 18, your next hurdle was to get to age 40. That's seriously how it was, because the life expectancy was not that great. So needless to say, I'm very impressed with this union that it allowed female members. And again, I just wonder if they had to put up with lip from other people because of it. I just wondered if all their members really wanted them there. Because you never know how some people feel until they open their mouth, So anyway, typographers were educated and they were economically mobile. And so, let's see here, because they were almost always around major urban centers for newspapers. It says here, the ITU president, Mr. Prescott, led the ITU in 1897 to win a 48-hour work week and a standard wage scale for all printers. Now, let's stop for a moment and talk about that. So here's the thing. It's talking about winning a 48-hour work week. So what does that mean? That means that the average work week was probably closer to 50 to 60 hours a week. A lot of labor. Like, just imagine if your job expected you to be there 50 to 60 hours a week. So that's why this guy wanted there to be an average work week of 48 hours, so that way people can have time to rest. That's actually really good. It then goes on to say that during the Great Depression, the ITU introduced the 40-hour work week across the industry at no cost to employers as a way to share the fewer jobs available. I don't really quite believe that, because the ITU is not the only one to introduce the 40-hour work week. I'm not even sure within their industry, because that was taking place all across the country in terms of labor unions. But however, I do think it's good that they did that, because here's the thing, the Great Depression was bad altogether. It was horrible. But good for this labor union and other labor unions in that they cut back the hours from like 50 to 60 hours a week to the 40-hour work week, so that way it would create more jobs for other people, so that way they could also have full-time employment and be able to provide for their families, right? So that's actually a really good thing that they did that. But I do think that other labor unions did that same thing as well, so I don't think it's just only them. It says, as the work of typographers declined with automation, computers, and mechanization of the print media, meaning they didn't keep up with the times, the ITU was disbanded. In 1986, a majority of ITU mailers voted to merge with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. We've talked about the Teamsters before. And the remaining typographers joined the Communications Workers of America. Good for them. That is awesome there. Now, a little bit of history. It says the concept for a typographical union was formed in New York City at a meeting of 18 representatives, and all men, from typographers associations in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Maryland, and Kentucky in December 1850. So they're trying to bring their groups all together, because if you bring them all together in terms of associations and you bring them together under one umbrella, then you have way more power and strength in landing really good contracts that pay really well for your labor. This next section, it's a little sad. It talks about how this union was kind of broken up not long after it was founded. So it says, technological developments in the late 19th century, such as the development of lithography and photography, led to diversification and specialization among printers. Further fragmentation in the printing labor movement led to the establishment of the International Printing Pressmen's Union of North America, really long title, in 1889. In 1892, the ITU authorized membership for mailers and for newspaper writers. Pressure mounted for a separate pressmen's union, and in 1892, the International Brotherhood of Bookbinders was formed. Many pressmen left the ITU for the bookbinders. At the same time as mailers joined, 2,000 pressmen members seceded to form the International Printing Pressmen Union Assistants, also another long title, in 1897, and the International Stereotypers and Electrotypers Union in 1902. So people are already kind of abandoning ship, because if I had to guess, the reason why they're doing that is because they're not landing really good contracts and they're not getting paid what they think they should be getting paid by their employers. So that I understand, because if the technology is changing but your union is not keeping up with the times, that is kind of a big problem with that. And then they kind of have some sad news here, which I think we've talked about before. It says, on October 1st, 1910, James McNamara, an ITU member, and his brother Joseph McNamara, Secretary-Treasurer of the International Union of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers, placed a bomb in the LA Times building, killing 21 people. They were convicted of the bombing and of the murders. Now, one thing I want to talk about here is we need to talk about why something like this would happen. First of all, they are responsible for their own actions, but also what we need to remember is that almost all these unions were founded by fascists. And fascism is not native to the United States. It's not native to the United States of America. It's actually native to the Soviet Union. After after the assassination of the Russian Tsar and his family, and fascism is also from Europe. So fascism, what's interesting about that is that you have people that have that ideology and believe in that ideology, but it's not from America, it was actually imported. So the way that happened is you have people that immigrate over here, they have their ideas and things like that, which, that's good to have ideas, but unfortunately with fascism, what happened was you have disgruntled employees, disgruntled citizens from other countries that immigrate over to the United States to have a so-called better life. And yes, they can have a better life, but all they really did in terms of the fascists that came over here, they started these labor unions. Almost every single one of these labor unions that we've talked about has had some fascists in it. if not communist. So, because it's not the American way. So, it's very concerning to me that, yes, we have people that immigrate over here for a better life, but some of them, they don't want a better life. They just want to steal from employers. And what I mean by that is that fascists, they hate employers. Like, they don't think that people have the right to own a company, and they think that if someone owns a company, they don't deserve to own it, and they don't deserve to make millions of dollars. Well, here's the thing. Yes, a business owner does deserve to own a company, and yes, they do deserve all the money that they make, because here's the thing. Do you really want to work for someone that's poor? Because poor people cannot afford to pay wages. So if anything, it's better to work for a company where they make millions and billions of dollars, because then your job will always be secure in terms of monies, and you will be more likely to be promoted and have bonuses, because the company will actually have money to spare and to reward its employees. But if you go along with the line of what fascists typically believe, they think that all employers are bad, workers are always good, workers never make mistakes, and that the employer should just never be rich and should be just as poor as the poorest person in the company. That is so dumb and so stupid and so unrealistic, it's pathetic. But that's what a lot of fascists think. Well, unfortunately, we have a lot of fascists in labor unions, and this is nothing new. It's been like that since the beginning of labor unions. They are very unrealistic about employment. Now, they did do some good in regards to benefits and things like that, and taking care of widows, taking care of children, and all that stuff like that. I don't have a problem with. That was already being done in the private sector before labor unions kind of, took that over and made it seem like they did everything, which they did not. But it's one of those things that, we need to call a spade here. And unfortunately, fascists, they have that problem with infiltrating countries and societies and also political parties and organizations, and they've done a pretty good job of infiltrating the United States and infiltrating labor unions. Well, they create them. They create labor unions. And then they have infiltrated the Democratic Party, because Republicans typically don't fall for this stuff because we're capitalists. Now, for those that don't understand what I mean by that, is that capitalists, if I don't like my boss, I can either have a meeting with my boss and say, hey, these are the issues that I'm having, and, I really want us to work this out, or you just simply go get a different job. Now, in terms of what fascists do and what some of these labor unions do, they think that if the boss is the problem, or they think the company is the problem, they think that they should just walk out and not ever go to the negotiation table, or even give the employer a chance to correct the issue. An example of this is the air traffic controller strike from the 1980s, and they were completely wrong in what they did. They were not very smart. So in case you're not aware of what that is, the air traffic controller strike happened in the 80s, and it happened when President Ronald Reagan was president. And so what happened was, the Air Traffic Controllers Union, they did not like the negotiations. They did not like the contract that was being negotiated between them and the federal government and whoever else. And so instead of going back to the table and renegotiating, they did a walkout all across the United States. And so when they did that, all jets were grounded. Like, basically they couldn't take off. Nothing. Like, nobody could get to their destination. So you had all these passengers, all these people in the United States that had purchased plane tickets, but yet they can't get anywhere because the air traffic controllers threw a temper tantrum like a 3-year-old brat on aisle 7 in a Toys R Us. Which, again, mind you, Toys R Us is not bankrupt, but it was still a really cool store. So, basically, President Ronald Reagan said, you have 24 hours, less than 24 hours to get back to your work, to get back to your jobs, or you're fired. And he had every right to do that, because here's the thing, this labor union, they had no right to take over all of the airports like that and say, hey, we're not gonna help planes land, we're not gonna help them take off. See, that's what happens when you get these labor unions that get too big for their britches. And that's why I get concerned at the CWA getting too big, because if they get too big, then they act like they own an industry and they founded an industry when they did not. Labor unions do not own industries. They do not own places of business. They did not invent anything. It's the individual people that own businesses. It's the individual people that invent things. But unfortunately, labor unions, they tend to think that they're bigger and better than everybody else. And here's another thing. In regards to the air traffic controller strike, they basically, they pretty much show their true colors and how they view themselves. They think that their labor is more important than the rest of the United States. And they don't care if other people can't get where they need to go. They don't care, hey, if your relative died and you're trying to get home, to go to their funeral, they don't care about that. Like they just didn't care about anybody else but themselves. And in that particular example, they also didn't care about the other labor unions that were affected, the other workers, which would include all the different pilots and the pilot associations and the flight stewardesses, as well as the airplane mechanics. And also there are quite a few workers at airports that are also unionized. So when air traffic controllers did not show up for work and basically said, hey, we own you, you don't own us, or you work for us, we don't work for you, it's like, wow, so you're totally basically telling off the entire United States and making it seem like your labor is more important than everybody else's when it is not. So thank goodness for President Ronald Reagan that he said, hey, you've got 24 hours to get back to your job or you're fired. Well, some of them did go back to work, but a lot of them were really angry. It's like, what are you complaining about? They have some of the highest paid jobs, and also all they have to do is go back to negotiations. That's just how it is with labor unions and labor union contracts. So it's like, just do what you're supposed to do. And here's another thing. If you don't like your job or you think you should be getting paid more, then go work in a different industry or get a different job. And, it's just like, the arrogance of some of these people is just unbelievable. But, at the same time, I think we're learning that labor unions tend to think pretty highly of themselves. But it's like, they talk real bad about the CEO or the owners and things like that, but yet they try and act like they own the company. So it's like, really, if these unions, they act like they own the company, I'm like, so if, say for example, this would never happen, but if a union takes over a company, are they going to shame and blame themselves for being a high-paying CEO? Of course not. Of course they're not going to do that. It would never dawn on them to do that because they think that as a worker, they have the right to do whatever they want, and they don't. See, what they don't realize is that employers also have workers' rights. And I'll say that again. Employers also have workers' rights because employers are workers as well. They are citizens of the United States, and they have to pay taxes just like anybody else, whether it's individual taxes or corporate taxes. So here's another thing. Employers, they have quite a bit of a burden in terms of what all they have to follow in terms of rules, laws, and regulations. So the last thing they need are a bunch of, disgruntled employees, trying to act like they own the company when they don't. I remember working with this one lady. She was bizarre, to say the least, but she was not like a highly paid worker, but she'd been at this company for a long time. And because she was in her 50s and she'd been at this company a long time, she acted like her name was on the side of the building and she acted like she owned it. And it got so old and it was so sad because I was like, how pathetic is this? That this lady thinks that she's that important. I mean, yes, she's a worker and she is important, but she's not the be-all end-all. She's not the owner. She's not the one who's writing the checks and signing the checks. She's not the one who's making all the money, but yet she acts like she's everybody's boss. And, there's a reason why. That's probably the reason why she wasn't really promotable. If anything, she just kept getting demoted. And she never figured out what the problem was. And the problem was her attitude and her lack of work ethic and how she treats people. It's just the arrogance. It was so weird. And unfortunately, I had to work with her. And believe me, I learned a lot from this woman. And it wasn't always good stuff. But anyway, needless to say, both the employer and the employees have workers' rights. So just realize that, whenever someone's talking trash about a company, you're actually talking trash about a person that took a leap of faith and started a company probably with almost nothing and risked everything to start a company from the ground up. I mean, I think that takes courage. And I mean, I don't know very many people that take on that kind of risk and then, have the patience to put up with people that talk smack about them and then try and, do all this labor union stuff and pick it outside their house like we saw in one previous podcast. I feel sorry for those people. I'm trying to remember which labor union that was. But I tell you what, if I was those people, I'd call the police on those labor union people because they picketed right outside the owner's house. I mean, if I was the wife, I'd be scared. I mean, just, my goodness, that would be kind of terrifying for the wife and for the children. See, that's how cruel labor unions and trade unions can be. They don't care who they hurt or who they make uncomfortable because to them, it's all about them. It's not about doing what's right. It's you're going to do what we want and we're going to make you miserable until you do what our sign says. It's like, you know what? That's intimidation. That's not right. If it's not right, if it's not legal or ethical or moral for an employer to intimidate employees, then it's not right for employees to intimidate an employer. You need to get along, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So it says in 1987, the printers of the ITU merged with the Communications Workers of America, CWA. It is now the Printing, Publishing, and Media Workers sector of the CWA. See, the CWA is really good. They're really smart. Instead of not allowing these people in which there weren't that many that joined the CWA, but, when they let them in, they went ahead and just created their own little sector for them, which is really good because, printing and media is not going anywhere. It's still going to be a part of our society. I mean, all you have to do is go to a bookstore and see how many books are still being sold and then see how many books are being sold on Amazon. I mean, especially like for me, I've been buying a lot of recipe books. And, here's another thing. If ever you need a book, but you want to get a cheaper price, go to Amazon.com, look up the new book, and then look where it says other options and see how much a used book is. And I've been able to get books for like pennies on the dollar. The most expensive thing I pay is shipping. If they don't ship with Amazon Prime, which most of them do. But anyway, if you want to save money like that, for sure do that, because there's nothing wrong with buying a used book. And a lot of them are almost like brand new, like they're in really good condition, so no complaints there. But anyway, that is it for this podcast. So we're not going over too much time, so that is good. But anyway, this labor union, again, it technically was disbanded, but its members were allowed to join the CWA. And the CWA, one of the reasons why they brought them under their umbrella was so that they would not lose their benefits, which I think is a really good thing to do because I think that would be really scary as a worker if you've worked somewhere for any amount of time and then now your labor union is disbanded, so then you lose your contract, you lose your benefits, and you lose your pension. I mean, that would be really scary. So, I'm actually really glad to see that the CWA took them under their wing. I just pray that they're not using them for monies or for power or for control, especially in regards to the political arena within the United States, because unfortunately a lot of these labor unions, they give millions of dollars to the Democratic Party. Every once in a while they make a donation to a Republican, but that's really rare. And I bet the Republican's thinking, why are they giving us money when they're usually Democrat? It's probably what they're thinking. But anyway, it would raise my eyebrows. But again, I don't think any labor union should be giving to any political party. I think that's a mistake. I personally don't care how they vote. I'm just glad that people get out and vote. And I think you need to vote for what you believe in and what you stand for. I think that's a wonderful thing. Even if I disagree with someone or if I don't think the candidate is a good candidate, I think people should vote for who they truly believe in as opposed to staying at home and doing nothing. So I think it's important to be a part of your country. It's important to be a part of society and to really get out there and live your life. I think that's a wonderful thing. But until next time, I pray that all of you are happy, healthy, and whole, that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.